Hey guys, welcome to our last section on Russia. We're going to be looking at Russia in modern time in today's world. So where we left off, we were talking about how communism ended with the reforms that Gorbachev put in. We said that in 1991, a man named Boris Yeltsin became the first president. In 1991, he became president. In 1999, he resigned. He stepped down. When a president steps down, his vice president is going to take over the presidency until the end of the term. So in 1999, Boris Yeltsin's vice president is the man that you're looking at in the upper photo there. And his name is Vladimir Putin. Most of you have probably heard about Vladimir Putin because we hear about him a lot in our news today. Okay, so Vladimir Putin takes over as president. He's going to be elected to 2 terms in office, once in 2000 and once in 2004. During these 8 years, Vladimir Putin was able to make Russia a major power in the world. So he's going to be responsible for really changing from communism to the current market economy that Russia has today. Now, along the way, Vladimir Putin, while president, did take back some of the democratic reforms that they put in place, making Russia more of a dictatorship in some ways than a democracy. So Vladimir Putin has more control in his government than our president would have in our country. So he serves 2 terms in office. In 2008, a new president takes over. His name is Dmitry Medvedev. He nominates, Putin as his prime minister. And that's perfectly legal to do. Now, a lot of people in Russia and around the world believe that Dmitry was simply like a puppet. He was there acting like the president, but it was really Vladimir Putin that was making the decisions. Now, the strange thing in Russia is that when they had another election in 2012, their elections are every 4 years, Vladimir Putin became president again. And a lot of students will say, well, how does that happen? He already served 2 terms in office. How could he be reelected in 2012? The rule states that a president can serve 2 consecutive terms in office. The word consecutive simply means in a row. So Vladimir Putin served 2 years in a row, 2 terms in a row, and then he took off for 4 years, which means in 2012 he could run again for president, which he did. He is still the current president of Russia today. If we look at the people in Russia, most of the people live in cities. Cities in Russia, some are really good, look like our modern cities, but there are many cities that are extremely poor. During communism, a lot of people didn't have money to buy houses, so instead of seeing a neighborhood of houses, in Russia you would actually see a neighborhood of apartment blocks. These apartment blocks were set up in the communist era when people couldn't afford houses. They were cheap living. Oftentimes, multiple families would live in one apartment, so it was not uncommon to have 15 people living in one apartment with 2 bedrooms. So they were crowded, they were tight. To escape the crowdedness, what they would do is simply vacation like in the areas of the Black Sea, get away from the city on a little bit of money that they may have had. If we look at Russia, Russia's involved in a lot of conflict today in multiple areas of the world. There are 2 common areas that we see conflict with Russia. One is going to be that little area on the map that we are looking at. That's the area of Chechnya. Chechnya is a real small area that does not want to be a part of Russia. They have 25 million people that are not Russian, and a lot of those people would rather have their own country. So as all those little countries to the west, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, sought their independence in the early 1990s, Chechnya did the same thing. The problem with Chechnya is that they were so small that Russia said, no, we're not going to grant you independence. So they declared themselves independent in 1991. Russia does not acknowledge them as independent. They are still fighting over this today. The other area that Russia is fighting in, we already discussed. They're fighting in Ukraine today because Ukraine is in the middle of a civil war. Part of their population wants to join with Russia, and the other part wants to remain Ukraine. Now, one item that we do talk about with Russia is that since they're so big, their transportation across their country has to be massive and it has to be good. Our country is also large. We rely on cars for the most part as people. In Russia, instead of relying on cars, since most of their roads are not in good shape because of their climate, most of Russia depends on trains, on railroads. We look across Russia, they have about 93,000 miles of railroad track. That's huge, the most out of any country in the world. Okay, in Russia, they move more goods, okay, across their rail than any other nation in the world. They also have the longest railroad, called the Trans-Siberian Railroad. This railroad track was about 5,700 miles. You can get on this train and travel from Moscow, which is on the west-hand side, okay, and it'll go all the way over to Vladivostok, which is on the east bottom, okay, and it's really cheap to do that. Most people will travel by train rather than driving their car. If we look at the economy of Russia today, doing pretty well, since they only came out of communism in the 90s. Okay, but the transition from that command system to a market system has been very difficult. Okay, the one big thing that happened was inflation. We've talked about inflation before. When inflation happens, the price of your products go really high while the value of your money goes really low. Now, Russian money is called the ruble, and you get to see a picture of it there. Now, the ruble during communist times was worth about $1.75 in our money. When they switched to a market system and inflation occurred, okay, what ends up happening is that the value of their ruble dropped to less than a penny. So in order to go to the store to buy food, they would have to bring hundreds of rubles in order to buy necessities, milk, bread, eggs, and so forth. Now, people were poor. They didn't have hundreds of rubles to buy groceries with. Okay, so they still needed those products. So we have to say, well, how did they get them? Okay, your money's worth this. You need food, you need shelter, you need, your toiletries and so forth. Most people turn to a market called the black market. The black market is simply a market where you buy and sell goods illegally. If we try to think of it something like in our country, you might think of New York City as you're walking down the sidewalk and a guy with a trench coat, comes up and he opens it up and it's full of watches and jewelry, and he's going to sell it to you for a really cheap price. And the reason he's able to sell it to you for a cheap price is because you're not quite sure where he got it from. Maybe he stole it. Maybe, he found it and now he's going to sell it for a profit. Okay, other common items on the black market: guns, drugs, the common things that we hear about in our news. If we also look at some other problems Russia has today, the other part deals with the environment. Now, the environment really took a hit under communism because they didn't have any laws protecting it. Under communism, they set those high production goals. They industrialized really fast, right? But they didn't care about where any of their waste went. They didn't care about replenishing any of the resources in their environment. So that's hitting them hard today in 2017. Okay, if we look at the areas that are hardest hit, Siberia was probably the worst. Siberia was home to all of those resources. We know they had oil and gold and silver, a lot of mining. And they didn't take care of the environment during that time. So as an example, if we look at Siberia, even kids 9, 10, 11 years old are being diagnosed with lung cancer because the air that they're living in is so polluted, it causes those toxins that develop cancer to happen. Okay, that's an extreme problem in Russia today. Just as some other examples, their water supply extremely contaminated. During the nuclear era, when Russia went out to develop nuclear weapons, okay, they took a lot of that nuclear waste and their, wasteful machines and so forth, and they would dump them into the rivers and into the seas. If we look at the Volga River, we're looking at the coastline of it there in that picture. A lot of the materials that they didn't use anymore, the machines, they would simply dump into the river. And as the tide comes up, it leaves that debris on the coastlines. This is an everyday look that they see in Russia. The Barents Sea is another example. The Navy in one instant took 17,000 containers of nuclear waste, and to get rid of it, they dumped it all into the sea, making the sea just toxic. Okay, because they didn't care. Now, the problem with this is that seas, okay, that water, doesn't stay in Russia, it travels. So other countries are also affected by Russia's pollution. So when that happens, the world kind of gets involved. Organizations like the UN step in and say, you can't do this. You need laws. Okay, so with the UN's urging and pushing, Russia, starting in the 2000s, had finally come up with some laws that would protect the environment, that would make it illegal for these factories, oil rigs and so forth, to dump their waste into the water and land supply. This concludes our notes for the Russia unit. Make sure you do the questions at the end. This next week we'll have our review guide and our test.